In the first days of October 1957, when the birch leaves were turning pale and the nights sharpened with frost, a lieutenant in a quilted coat stepped down from a military truck at the edge of a village east of Kyshtym. He carried a paper stamped in purple ink. Behind him, soldiers spread out with the awkward obedience of men who had been told not to ask questions. A dog barked until it was silenced with a boot. An old woman came to her gate holding a pail. A schoolboy, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, watched the men as if they had arrived from another planet. The lieutenant read the order in a flat voice. Families were to gather what they could carry, leave their livestock, lock their doors, and assemble by the road. No reason was given. There was no enemy in sight, no fire on the horizon, only an early sun that made the puddles shine like thin ice. The villagers obeyed with that mixture of fear and habit which centuries of power cultivate. The state has spoken. The rest is silence. Later, some would remember, and many would deny, that the grass had looked oddly pressed, as if by an invisible hand, that the dust on the road had seemed heavier than dust, that the milk in the pails, so ordinary yesterday, had become, without warning or announcement, a kind of slow poison. One must begin with that silence, because Kyshtym was not merely an accident of chemistry and engineering. It was the natural fruit of a policy, and the policy was secrecy. Secrecy in the Soviet Union was not an accessory to government, but a method of rule, a substitute for consent, and often for competence. The men who built the atomic complex at Mayak did not only conceal their work from foreigners, they concealed it from their own neighbors, from their own physicians, from their own wives. In such a system, the concealment is not an afterthought. It is part of the design, like the walls of a fortress. It makes certain achievements possible, speed, concentration, obedience, but it also makes certain disasters inevitable. For what cannot be spoken cannot be corrected, and what cannot be corrected must eventually be endured. When the Second World War ended, the Soviet Union stood among the victors with a grief that victory could not dissolve. It had lost whole generations, villages, cities, armies. It had been saved by a brutal endurance and by the vastness of its land. But it had also been shown, with the blinding clarity that war sometimes provides, what modern power had become. Not merely rifles and tanks, but laboratories, reactors, and the ability to compress the sun into a weapon. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not only tragedies, they were messages. The American monopoly on the bomb was a strategic fact, but in Moscow it was felt as a metaphysical insult. The West had mastered a new fire. The Soviet state, built on the promise of modernity, could not remain without it. So the Soviet atomic project rose with a fervor that resembled religion and with a discipline that resembled a prison. It drew into itself brilliant physicists and obedient engineers, but also convicts, soldiers, and administrators trained in fear. Its patronage was political. Its urgency was existential. In the late 1940s, in the southern Urals, a region of forests and lakes that had once seemed remote even to Russians, the state erected a secret industrial city devoted to plutonium, a place whose name was removed from maps and replaced with numbers, Chelyabinsk 40, later Chelyabinsk 65, so that even language would participate in concealment. Nearby lay the ordinary town of Kyshtym, which had the misfortune of being the nearest known name. History would attach the disaster to it, as if naming were a kind of justice. Mayak was built quickly, under pressure, with the characteristic Soviet confidence that time could be bullied. The urgency was real, the haste was fatal. In those early years, the Soviet bomb makers were not choosing between perfect safety and modest risk. They were choosing between imperfect safety and what they perceived as national extinction. The reactors had to run, the plutonium had to be extracted, the waste had to go somewhere. In a calmer civilization, somewhere would have been debated in public. tested in pilot projects, overseen by independent authority. In the Soviet system, it was handled by committees that answered upward, not outward. The surrounding population, mostly rural and politically invisible, was treated as landscape. Radioactive waste is history in a chemical disguise. It remembers what men prefer to forget. It does not rot into harmlessness on a human schedule. It asks for patience from a species trained to act, and for humility from institutions that are rewarded for speed. The high-level waste from plutonium production, hot with radioactivity and heat, must be cooled, diluted, contained. If it is stored, it must be stored as if one were storing a moral debt. But Mayak began by paying its debts to the river. For years, liquid waste was discharged into the Techa River system, and the river did what rivers always do. It carried the consequences downstream. Villagers drank the water, bathed in it, washed clothes in it. Children played on the banks. Cows drank and gave milk. Fish were caught and eaten. The people could not have known what they were receiving. The state did not tell them, and the physicians who noticed strange illnesses were denied the information that would have made their observations coherent. In time, some villages were moved, some were instructed to stop using certain wells, some were offered explanations that were half-truths. But the principle remained. The program's needs were secret. The program's harms were secret. And secrecy, in the absence of accountability, becomes not merely concealment, but permission. By the mid-1950s, the managers of Mayak had begun to shift some of the waste from rivers to storage. Underground tanks were constructed to hold high-level radioactive solutions. These tanks were equipped with cooling systems because the waste generates heat as it decays. If the cooling fails, the temperature can rise. If the waste concentrates and dries, it can become chemically unstable. A reactor accident is a violent lesson, but a waste accident is a slow one until it is suddenly not. The danger accumulates quietly, like resentment, and then releases itself all at once. On September 29, 1957, that release occurred. The official Soviet story, such as it later became, would be careful and spare, like a confession extracted under supervision. But the essential sequence is clear. In one of the waste tanks at the Mayak complex, the cooling system failed, whether from design flaws, poor maintenance, instrument failure, or the more human element, complacency born of routine. The waste heated over time. Water evaporated, salts and nitrates concentrated. The tank became, in effect, a sealed vessel with a growing internal energy and an increasingly reactive mixture. Then, in the afternoon, the tank exploded, not with the nuclear flash that laymen imagine, but with a chemical detonation powerful enough to tear off heavy concrete lids and throw debris into the air. A plume of radioactive material rose and drifted with the wind across the countryside. The Soviet state had built Mayak as a city of secrets. Now it had produced a secret cloud. The wind carried that cloud northeast, laying down a long, thin band of contamination that would later be called the East Ural radioactive trace. The phrase is almost poetic, and like many official phrases, it dulls the pain it describes. A trace suggests a footprint, a faint mark. This was, in places, a saturation of soil with radionuclides, strontium, cesium, and the other alphabet of decay, that would remain dangerous for decades. It crossed forests and fields, villages and pastures. It settled on roofs, in gardens, on hay. It entered milk, then bones. It entered, too, the moral bloodstream of a state that could not admit error without threatening its own mythology of control. How does a government respond when the truth is classified? First, it responds as governments often do. It tries to manage the event as if it were a matter of image. But image management fails when the enemy is physics. Radiation cannot be persuaded by slogans. It is indifferent to ideology. The only way to protect people is to inform them, move them, and change behavior. Yet informing people in a secret city about a secret industry is an invitation to questions. And in the Soviet administrative imagination, questions are the beginning of disobedience. So the initial response was shaped by the same logic that had created the danger: containment of information as well as of isotopes. Soldiers and internal security forces were deployed to survey, to clean, to restrict movement. Zones were drawn on maps that did not exist to ordinary citizens. Roads were blocked. Villages were told to evacuate, some quickly, some late, some not at all. People were forbidden to harvest mushrooms or berries, not because the state had suddenly become protective of nature, but because the forest had become a pantry of contamination. Cattle were slaughtered, crops were buried or burned. In some places, topsoil was scraped away. In others, earth was plowed under in the hope that dilution might substitute for removal. Houses in the most contaminated villages were dismantled or burned. The landscape was treated as an object to be rearranged, and the people as inconvenient tenants. The tragedy was multiplied by delay. In radiation exposure, time is a moral unit. If you evacuate quickly, you save thyroids and marrow. If you delay, you trade lives for the convenience of bureaucracy. In some settlements, residents lived for days and weeks under the falling dust, milking cows, eating from gardens, drinking from wells, while officials argued over protocols and classifications. The villagers were not told that the dust on their windowsills was not merely dust. They were told to move for sanitary reasons, as if hygiene were the issue. In a state that had trained its people to accept commands without explanation, the absence of explanation did not prevent obedience. It only prevented understanding. The workers at Mayak, the engineers, technicians, guards, and laborers, were in a different position, but not a safer one. They were closer to the source, and many were ordered to participate in cleanup and containment. They had some protective equipment, but early nuclear industries everywhere, not only in the Soviet Union, often treated workers as expendable. In the Soviet case, that tendency was amplified by the culture of sacrifice and by the lack of independent oversight. Those who received high doses were treated, observed, sometimes studied, and often sworn to silence. The state that had found the atom's secret also discovered, more than it admitted, the uses of secrecy in medicine: to hide casualties, to preserve morale, to keep the program moving. What did the people see? They saw trucks and soldiers, fences where there had been paths, men with instruments walking fields like surveyors of an invisible war. They saw neighbors moved overnight. They heard rumors that America had attacked, that a meteor had fallen, that a chemical plant had burned. They saw, in some cases, sickness without a name: nausea, weakness, skin burns, strange fevers. They did not see the ledger that counted their exposure in Röntgens and Sieverts. They did not see the internal reports that connected symptoms to isotopes. The state possessed the knowledge, and in possessing it, it possessed also the power to distribute ignorance. It is tempting to describe this as uniquely Soviet, but one should be honest. The early nuclear age everywhere was born under military secrecy, and everywhere it tempted leaders to treat citizens as subjects rather than as participants. Yet the Soviet system gave this temptation the dignity of doctrine. It did not merely hide, it taught that hiding was virtue. It did not merely restrict, it made restriction the definition of loyalty. In such an environment, the incentives of every actor align toward concealment. The factory director wants to avoid disgrace. The minister wants to avoid political embarrassment. The regional official wants to avoid punishment for spreading panic. The physician wants to avoid being accused of violating state secrets. Even the conscientious man learns to speak in euphemisms, to write in cautious phrases, to avert his eyes from the full implication of what he knows. The bureaucratic chain becomes, in effect, a chain of silence. And silence has its own epidemiology. Public health depends on information: who is exposed, to what, in what dose, for how long. It depends on candor, the ability to admit a hazard without treating admission as treason. It depends on trust, the willingness of citizens to alter behavior because they believe the warning is for their good, not for the state's convenience. The Kyshtym disaster undermined all three. It made the very instruments of health, doctors, nurses, local administrators, into agents of concealment. It turned the landscape into an archive that could not be read in public. It forced people to live in a contradiction. They were asked to obey protective measures without being told what they were being protected from. Consider the evacuation itself, which in the Soviet Union had an almost archaic character. The sudden decree, the trucks, the hurried packing, the leaving behind of animals and household gods. For the peasant, the house is not merely property. It is memory, labor crystallized into walls. To abandon it without explanation is to feel not only fear but insult, as if one's life were a minor inconvenience. Many were resettled in new villages or towns, often with inadequate compensation and with lingering stigma. Some were placed under medical observation. Some were recorded in registries that were themselves secret. A person could become, in effect, a classified document. Yet even those who were moved were not necessarily saved. Radiation does not respect administrative boundaries. If you drink contaminated milk for weeks, you carry the event into your bones. Moving later does not remove what has already lodged within. And for those not evacuated, either because their villages were judged less contaminated or because the state wished to minimize the scale of the problem, life continued under a haze of uncertainty. Fields were farmed with restrictions that shifted and contradicted. Children were told not to play in certain places without being told why. The countryside became a geography of half-knowledge. In time, to reduce public visibility, the state transformed the most contaminated region into a forbidden zone. It was fenced and guarded. Entry required permission. Later, it would be called a nature reserve. A bitter irony, for it was nature made dangerous by human ambition. The forests and lakes within that zone would grow quiet, not because they had been preserved by ecological wisdom, but because they had been abandoned by necessity. Animals would thrive where humans could not safely linger. The landscape would return, in part, to wilderness. It was one of history's darker jokes. The atom, pursued as the emblem of progress, created a sanctuary by making civilization poisonous. Kyshtym was not the only wound at Mayak. A decade later, in 1967, another event, wind lifting radioactive dust from a partially dried waste lake, would spread contamination again. Over the decades, the region would carry a layered burden. Early river discharges, the 1957 explosion, later resuspension events, chronic releases. But Kyshtym stands as a turning point because it revealed in concentrated form the hazard of treating secrecy as a substitute for safety. It was not merely that a tank exploded, it was that a society's methods of governance, its reflex for concealment, its fear of disclosure, its punishment of truth-telling, shaped both the disaster and the suffering that followed. One might ask, why conceal at all when the consequences are written on bodies? The answer lies in the psychology of authoritarian institutions. Such institutions prize stability over truth and often confuse the two. They fear that admitting error will erode legitimacy. And because legitimacy is thin, they respond by tightening control. The result is a vicious circle. The more the state conceals, the more it must conceal, because each concealment creates another vulnerability. A government that is confident can survive embarrassment. A government that is anxious treats embarrassment as mortal danger. In the Soviet Union, this anxiety had historical roots. The Tsarist autocracy had long relied on censorship and secret police. The Bolshevik Revolution, despite its rhetoric of liberation, inherited and refined these tools. The Civil War and the purges taught administrators that a wrong word could destroy a career or a life. Under such conditions, even good men learn that survival depends on obedience and discretion. When the atomic age arrived, it did not introduce secrecy. It merely gave secrecy a new justification. Moreover, nuclear work lent itself naturally to classification. The physics of bombs was military. The production of plutonium was strategic. The Soviet state could argue, with some reason, that disclosure would aid enemies. But classification expands like a gas. It fills whatever volume it is allowed. Soon, not only designs but accidents became secrets. Not only weapons, but waste became classified. Not only the program, but its victims became matters of state security. The line between protecting the nation and protecting reputations was easily blurred, and in practice, reputations often won. Thus, Kyshtym became, for decades, a disaster without a name. The surrounding people knew something had happened. They had lived it. But they did not have language to place it in the national story. In a culture where newspapers were instruments of policy, and policy required silence, there could be no public mourning. Memory remained local, whispered, fragmented. A child might hear that the soldiers came, that we had to leave, that the river was bad, but the full narrative was unavailable. The event became a rumor with consequences. Outside the Soviet Union, knowledge came slowly and imperfectly. Western intelligence had some indications: unusual medical reports, restricted zones, the movement of populations, but secrecy and geography worked together. The Urals were far from capitals. Mayak was hidden behind code names and fences. In the 1970s, dissident scientists and writers began to speak more openly. The name Kyshtym entered Western discussion. But even then, the data were partial, contested, clouded by propaganda on both sides of the Cold War. The Soviet state denied. The West suspected. The victims waited. Only in the late Soviet period, under the loosening pressures of glasnost, did official acknowledgement emerge. Even then, acknowledgement was carefully calibrated. A government can admit what it can no longer hide, but it can still choose the manner of admission, the details it offers, the numbers it minimizes, the responsibilities it diffuses into systemic errors or technical failures. The admission may satisfy historians without satisfying justice, and justice, in the realm of public health, is inseparable from knowledge. To measure the human cost of Kyshtym is to confront the difficulty of counting what was deliberately obscured. Some received acute doses and suffered immediate illness. Others received lower doses that increased long-term risks. Cancer, especially, is a cruel witness. It appears years later, and it is easily dismissed as natural. When a state denies exposure, it denies causation. When it denies causation, it denies compensation and reform. Epidemiology becomes, in such a setting, not merely a science, but a political act. To ask whether leukemia rates rose, whether thyroid cancers increased, whether birth defects occurred more often, these questions become threats. The data, if collected, are classified. If published, are censored. If whispered, are punished. Yet the body keeps records more faithfully than archives. Strontium behaves like calcium. It enters bones and marrow. Cesium behaves like potassium. It disperses through muscle. Iodine concentrates in the thyroid. These are not metaphors, but pathways. To live in a contaminated zone is to have one's metabolism conscripted into the story of the state. The people around Mayak became, without consent, participants in a vast, uncontrolled experiment, an experiment whose results were not freely shared and whose subjects were not honored. One must also consider the moral injury inflicted by forced ignorance. Imagine being told to relocate, losing your home, seeing officials burn houses and bury crops, and yet being denied the truth of why. Imagine sickness in the family, and doctors who speak evasively because they too are afraid. Such experiences create not only physical harm, but a particular kind of cynicism, the belief that the state will sacrifice you and then deny that it has done so. In a civilization where trust is already scarce, such events deepen the scarcity. People learn to treat official statements as theater and rumors as reality. That is not merely a social consequence, it is a public health hazard. For when the next crisis comes, citizens who have been lied to do not easily believe warnings, even when warnings are sincere. Kyshtym also shaped the internal culture of the Soviet nuclear industry. Even secret institutions learn from disaster, but they often learn the wrong lessons. A transparent system might respond by opening scrutiny, improving designs, creating independent safety bodies, and admitting the truth to affected populations. A secret system responds by tightening control, improving technical measures, while reinforcing information barriers. It may add layers of security not only against foreign spies, but against domestic awareness. It becomes safer in one sense and more dangerous in another. Safer from repetition of the same mechanical failure, more dangerous because the underlying pathology, fear of disclosure, remains. The Soviet Union did, over time, improve many aspects of nuclear safety and waste management, as did other nuclear powers. But the habit of secrecy persisted, and it would manifest again, most famously at Chernobyl in 1986. There, too, delay and denial amplified exposure. There, too, information control became a contaminant. The Soviet state, confronted by a crisis that could not be contained within fences, found itself defeated by the very methods it had relied upon. It is one of history's ironies that an empire built on control was undone, in part by forces it could not control: economic reality, national awakenings, and, quietly, persistently, the truth. If one seeks the larger meaning of Kyshtym, it is not that the Soviet Union was uniquely wicked or that nuclear technology is uniquely cursed. It is that complex technologies require complex virtues. They require patience, humility, openness to criticism, and a willingness to slow down when speed is seductive. They require institutions that can absorb bad news without punishing the messenger. They require a public that is treated not as a child to be shielded from frightening facts, but as an adult partner in risk. Secrecy is sometimes necessary. There are matters of defense, diplomacy, and individual privacy that should not be shouted in the streets. But secrecy as a general principle, the instinct to hide because hiding is easier than reform, corrupts even the noblest projects. It makes error permanent by making error unmentionable. It turns administrators into protectors of appearances rather than guardians of lives. It teaches citizens that the truth is always elsewhere, owned by someone above them, withheld for reasons that may or may not be real. In such a climate, the state becomes not a common enterprise, but an occupying force within its own borders. Kyshtym's peculiar cruelty lies in its invisibility. An earthquake leaves rubble, a fire leaves ash, a flood leaves a high water mark on a wall. Radiation leaves little that the eye can confirm. It marks the soil and the cells, not the skyline. It is therefore the perfect companion of secrecy. Both act without spectacle. The victim feels ill, but cannot point to a wound. The farmer sees a good harvest and cannot see the isotopes on the grain. The child runs through a field and cannot see the dose accumulating in the body. In such cases, the duty of government is not merely to act, but to speak, to supply, with words, the visibility that nature does not provide. When government refuses this duty, it forces citizens to live in a world where danger has no name and, therefore, no remedy. Even historical memory, which seems so resilient, can be bent by silence. For decades, Kyshtym was absent from textbooks and newspapers. It lived instead in the memories of evacuees, in family stories told carefully, in the guarded conversations of physicians and engineers. This shaped not only the past, but the future. A society that does not publicly remember its disasters cannot publicly learn from them. It repeats patterns under new names. It builds new tanks, new fences, new euphemisms. The dead become statistics without ceremony, and the living inherit a culture in which accountability is always postponed. And yet memory, like radiation, is difficult to erase. It returns in the testimonies of survivors, in the work of dissident scholars, in the eventual opening of archives, in the stubborn facts of contaminated landscapes that refuse to become ordinary. The forests northeast of Mayak will remain, for generations, a kind of negative monument, not a statue erected by gratitude, but a zone defined by exclusion. It will remind those who know the story that the earth can become an archive without our consent, and that nature, indifferent to our politics, will preserve the evidence we try to bury. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is the simplest. The Soviet leaders who demanded secrecy believed that they were protecting the state. In the short term, they did protect a program. Mayak continued to produce, the bomb was built, parity was achieved. But in the long term, they weakened the very foundations of national strength, the health of citizens, the trust that binds people to institutions, the habit of truth that makes correction possible. A civilization can survive many hardships if it can speak honestly about them. It is dishonesty, more than hardship, that becomes fatal, because it prevents adaptation. When leaders cannot admit a mistake, they are condemned to repeat it, and to build their future on a lie that grows heavier each year. So Kyshtym remains not only a chapter in nuclear history, but a parable of governance. It shows how a state can treat its own people as collateral without ever using that word, how bureaucracy can convert a human tragedy into a classification problem, how the control of information, so useful in war, can become, in peace, a quiet form of violence. It also shows, in the end, the stubbornness of reality. You can censor newspapers. You cannot censor isotopes. You can relocate villages. You cannot relocate the past. You can build a closed city and give it a number. You cannot number the consequences into harmlessness. On that autumn morning, when the lieutenant read his order in a village near Kyshtym, he performed his duty with the blankness of a man trained to obey. He likely believed, as millions believed, that obedience was patriotism. The villagers, packing their lives into sacks, believed only that resistance was dangerous. Between them stood the state, faceless, remote, insisting on silence. But above them, drifting on the wind, was something even more indifferent than the state, the dust of decay, descending without malice and without mercy, turning secrecy into a physical condition. History, when it wishes to teach, often chooses such instruments, not thunderbolts, but slow, invisible proofs that no society, however powerful, can escape the consequences of what it refuses to face.